Hi, guys. Welcome to our first lesson on the Great Depression. Think back to what we learned in the 1920s before break, right? So, remember, everything's going great. The 1920s are roaring. The decade is an economic boom. Things are fantastic. And then, as we're going to learn, at the end of 1929, it all comes crashing down. And why? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at today. So, today, we're going to take a look at the nation's sick economy. More specifically, we're going to try to answer the question, what were the causes of the Great Depression? So, I recommend before our final, right, if it would really help, grab a pencil, some paper, or open up some notes, get ready to take some notes, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a good answer for this question. So, before we dive into the actual causes of the Great Depression, let's talk real quick about who was in charge of the country, basically, when the crap hit the fan, right? So, the president at the time was a guy named Herbert Hoover. He was from Iowa originally. He was the first US president to have been born west of the Mississippi River. He actually had worked as a mining engineer and a mining consultant. So, he had traveled the world and he actually built up a sizable personal fortune. And when World War I broke out, he became active in humanitarian work and he chaired the Commission for Relief in Belgium, which was this commission that provided relief to that country as it faced a food crisis that was brought on by the German invasion during the war. He also served as the director of the American Relief Administration, which was formed in 1919, and it was tasked with supplying relief to countries that were destroyed during the war in Europe and in Russia. And during the First World War, he was appointed by President Woodrow Wilson as head of the U.S. Food Administration, which was in charge of reducing consumption in order to avoid food rationing during war. And he went on to serve as the Secretary of Commerce in the administration of Warren G. Harding. And once he was in office, he was elected in 1928. He sought to reform the nation's regulatory system. He encouraged cooperation of the federal government and big business. Uh, Under his direction, the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Justice Department, they prosecuted gangsters like Al Capone for tax evasion. He really considered himself a progressive, although a lot of historians today, I wouldn't really say that about him. But this was kind of reflected in some of his administration's policies. He reorganized the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He engaged in the organization of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He closed tax loopholes for the wealthiest Americans. He expanded national park lands, and he strengthened protections for labor. And his most notable foreign policy achievements were in Latin America. So his administration really laid the groundwork for what became the Good Neighbor policy under his successor, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who we will definitely talk about later. And this Good Neighbor policy explicitly disavowed military interventionism in hemispheric relations. So he actually embarked on a goodwill tour in Latin America. He traveled to 10 countries there, delivered pledges to reduce U.S. political and military interference in the affairs of Latin American countries. And he actually was successful in mediating a dispute between Chile and Peru over some land. So that's a little bit about him as president. And one of his big campaign promises when he ran originally for president and was elected in 1928 was a chicken in every pot. That was his promise. And basically that meant that he expected under his leadership that everyone would be prosperous. Everybody would have enough money for some food. Everything would just be great, just like it had been. Basically, the idea was that if you continued electing Republicans as they had in throughout the 1920s, that the nation is going to continue to be prosperous. Now, listen to this little snippet from one of his campaign speeches. It says, by adherence to the principles of decentralized government, ordered liberty, equal opportunity, and freedom to the individual, our American experiment in human welfare has yielded a degree of well-being unparalleled in all the world. It has come nearer to the abolition of poverty, to the abolition of fear of want, than humanity has ever reached before. That's a pretty powerful statement that Hoover is making right there. to say that we've reached a point in where humanity doesn't have to want anymore, man, he's really going to seriously eat those words, and pretty quickly too. It's going to come back to bite him. So when it comes to the causes of the Great Depression, most historians agree on four things that really were the causes of the root of the Great Depression. The first one being overproduction. And I'm not just talking about in factories. It also had a lot to do with the overproduction of farming in the 1920s, and actually even before that. The second is an unequal distribution of wealth. Turns out the roaring 20s weren't necessarily roaring for everyone, right? The third reason was easy credit. So people borrowed way too much money in the 1920s. And the fourth thing was the collapse of the stock market. Now, overproduction in farming really started back during World War I. In a push to try to help win the war, farmers went nuts in the United States. They kept expanding their farms and producing and producing and producing. When the war was over, the demand for their products basically fell off, which caused a huge price plummet. And that left farmers kind of hanging with a lot of debt to deal with. They had debt to pay on the land, and they also had a lot of debt to pay on equipment that they purchased in order to produce all this food that the armies needed for the war. And this started to cause some serious problems. When we talk about farming in the Great Depression, we also have to mention the Dust Bowl. This was a severe drought that hit in the early 1930s, primarily in the Great Plains region, where most of the nation's food was being produced. And when you start to combine this drought with the overproduction that farmers were doing, this drive to produce as much as they possibly could, basically that just led to a huge natural disaster. Essentially, the way the farmers were farming the land, they turned the topsoil, the most fertile parts of the soil, into a fine dust. And during this drought, the dust got even worse, and then winds kicked up. Those winds picked up that dust and started blowing it all the way across the country. And when I say the winds kicked up this fine dirt and dust into a big storm and blew it across the country, I really mean it really picked it up and started blowing it across the country. So here's where I'm going to kind of cue the mini Dust Bowl montage. So here's some pictures from the Dust Bowl, this event that took place, this natural disaster that took place. As you can see, this child in overalls on the right, having to cover his mouth. The dust was so fine that it would seep into people's homes even through the cracks in their walls. And people would be putting up blankets to try to keep the dust out. Otherwise, it'd be getting in their eyes, getting in their mouths as they breathed, just constantly. And you can see the man on the left as well. So, as I go through, take a look at these pictures and see what people had to deal with in the Great Plains and across the rest of the country. This natural disaster known as, the Dust Bowl really kind of picks up during this time. You can see here how thick the cloud has gotten, the dust cloud. And it's going to pretty much, as it reaches the homes, it's going to totally swamp the people there, right? You won't be able to see your hand in front of you at some point. You can see here again just how tall, massive. We're not talking like a little tiny tiny amount of dust. It's just a little blurry and foggy. Like, no. This is pretty bad. So the other major source of overproduction was in factories. Factories during the Great War expanded exponentially to supply goods for the military. Basically, what started happening in the 1920s was slowly the supply being produced by these factories started outpacing the demand. There's a lot more supply than there was a demand. And that leads to prices falling. And with prices falling, businesses have a hard time staying afloat. So basically, by the end of the 1920s, people had pretty much bought up everything they wanted to buy. And most of that was on credit. The second main cause of the Great Depression was this unequal distribution of wealth. Basically, the gap between the rich and the poor during the 1920s actually got bigger. Now, there's this misconception that in the 20s, everything was roaring, right? And everybody was doing great. Well, yeah, if you were at the top of the pile, you were doing fantastic. If you're at the bottom of the pile, you might have been doing a little bit better than you had before. But, if you just come up one or two notches, you're still not really doing all that great, right? In fact, in the 1920s, the top 1% of Americans, economically speaking, made as much money as the combined lower 42%. That's a huge uneven distribution of wealth. A very small group of people had pretty much all the money. So does that sound familiar? It should, kind of, because that's exactly what happened during the Gilded Age when we studied that period. But here's the difference. During the 1920s, especially with the consumer culture that we learned about, the lower and middle economic classes wanted to kind of feel like they were doing better than they really were. They started buying things on credit to make themselves look more successful. Eventually, this is going to come back to bite us. And that brings us to number 3 on the list of causes of the Great Depression: easy credit. The lower middle economic classes in the 1920s bought all sorts of consumer products on credit, like radios, right? Cars, but they didn't actually have the money to pay for it up front. This really starts to mask a huge economic problem here in the United States. In order to have a healthy economy, you need to have people continually buying products. When people start buying things on credit, they eventually reach a point where all the money that they're spending is basically going back to the debt that they've amassed instead of buying new things. And if people can't buy new things, that starts to put a hurt on factories. That starts to get people losing their jobs, and that starts to slow down the economy. And that brings us to point number 4 on causes of the Great Depression: the collapse of the stock market. Again, in order to make themselves seem wealthier, most middle and lower income people started to dabble in the stock market. And they did so by doing what's called buying on the margin. That's the equivalent of using credit to buy stocks, to invest in publicly traded companies, right? They planned on using the profits of the stocks that they bought to pay back the loans that they used to buy the stocks in the first place. I'm going to talk more about this in detail in tomorrow's lesson, right? Well, at the end of the 1920s, the stock market really starts to slow down. And when it starts to go a little bit south, people that had bought on the margin, they really start to panic. And all that does was drive the market even lower. And the crash of the stock market is pretty significant and important. And I'll actually devote an entire lesson to it in and of itself tomorrow. So when the stock market collapses in 1921, that's kind of the last straw. The fabric of our economy was really just barely hanging on. And when the stock market starts to go south, it just drags the rest of the economy right down with it. And the big issue was most Americans, they weren't prepared for what was going to happen. All right, guys. So today I really just have one takeaway for you, and that's quite simply: remember the causes of the Great Depression: overproduction, unequal distribution of wealth, that easy credit, and the collapse of the stock market. Those are the things that really caused the nation to really sink into a depression. So hopefully you got some good notes. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll make sure to try to explain it or help you out.